even for Donald Trump, seeing him use the F-bomb like that, it was pretty extraordinary, right?
Yeah, and, we perhaps shouldn't be shocked by this anymore. I think in his second administration, he's getting a lot looser than he used to be. We're seeing Donald Trump as he likes to be seen, I think. He doesn't play by old school rules. He's not a creature of DC. He speaks in this macho way. I think he kind of enjoys the looseness. I think he enjoys being able to speak like that to the world, unlike any other world leader, really.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is the Morning Edition. It's Thursday, June 26. Donald Trump has accused Israel and Iran of already breaking the ceasefire that he brokered in a furious tirade against both countries as the president left for a NATO summit in the Netherlands. Meanwhile, multiple American media outlets are reporting that Sunday's bunker blitz did not in fact destroy Iran's 3 key nuclear sites. Today, National Environment Editor and former US correspondent Nick O'Malley on the series of events which left Iran dangerously exposed. Nick, Iran and Israel have entered a ceasefire orchestrated by Donald Trump. Now, it's quite astonishing considering that just a few days ago the US bombed 3 Iranian nuclear sites. So can you bring us up to speed?
Yeah, the US bombed those sites, and then Iran struck back, which President Trump almost seemed to welcome, suggests a little bit of theatre going on there. And now we're in what you might call a shaky ceasefire.
President Trump says Israel and Iran have agreed to a complete and total ceasefire.
It was an announcement made the only way Donald Trump can. The US president declaring peace in the Middle East on social media.
12 days of trading blows, hundreds of civilian casualties, and America intervening with strikes of its own. The US president has declared the war between Israel and Iran will end within 24 hours.
And that is extraordinary. It is extraordinary that the US and Israel and Iran have stepped back. But it doesn't really tell us much about the future. I mean, this is still a very, very fragile situation. And I think it'd only be a brave person who would try and predict where we'll be in a month, in 6 months, or in 2 years, because nuclear weapons development programs are long-running programs. And this enmity between Israel and Iran and the US goes back decades.
So I just want to ask you about something you said there about the orchestrated nature, but suggests it was orchestrated. Just to step people back through the timeline of this, Sunday Australian time, we get the news that the US has struck Iran.
Yep.
Then in the early hours of Tuesday morning, we learn that Iran has actually retaliated by launching missiles at a US base in Qatar. Donald Trump responds quite quickly, saying it's a very weak response, but then seems to almost thank Iran for the heads up and pivots straight into saying now's the time for peace. What does that say about the nature of this reprisal?
This was a strike, obviously, not against the US in the US. It was, as everybody expected, a limited strike against a US base in the region. And Trump's language seems to suggest either there was back-channeling, formally or informally, or that in this delicate dance the various players are playing here, that was such a soft response that it signalled to the US, hey, we have to strike you now. We're a regime. We have to stand up for it. We have to be seen to be standing up to the United States. But it was also signalling de-escalation. And that is obviously the way Trump received it. And obviously Trump was then determined to broadcast that. He was determined to suggest, okay, I've done my thing. I've come in with my big stick. Now everyone can step back.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the timeline of the ceasefire? Trump obviously came out and said it's been agreed, but we didn't hear from Israel and Iran straight away. It was a quite extraordinary day. Can you tell us a bit more about how that played out?
Well, Trump made his announcement, and then he obviously emphasised it on social media, which is the way he speaks to the world. We don't know exactly what Iran and Israel knew at the time. just that this had been announced. And this is obviously the way Trump deals with the world in domestic affairs, in foreign affairs. He makes pronouncements. He insists, sometimes completely falsely, sometimes correctly, that this is the way the world is. And now he is a man, obviously, who wields an enormous amount of power, and the most amount of power at present, perhaps, in this region. So therefore, if he is making that pronouncement, banging those heads together, well, then maybe that power is real.
Now, as I said, it didn't become clear until later in the day who had agreed to what or when. Of course, Iran and Israel both did make announcements that, yes, indeed, we have agreed to the ceasefire. But then there were accusations from both sides that they had breached the ceasefire deal. This obviously annoyed Donald Trump. I think it's fair to say he exploded with rage overnight. Tell us what happened.
Well, this is often the way ceasefires work. There are volleys of missiles or attacks or aggression at that cusp moment.
Well, they are watching very closely, as we are, to see whether, in fact, missiles have been fired from Iran toward Israel this morning or not. As we sort through that information to try to determine what exactly happened, that really hits home the point, Becky, of just how critical a moment we are in right now and how critical the coming hours are ahead to see if this ceasefire...
Now, Donald Trump, he's keen for a few things. One thing is he wants to rule the roost at NATO. He is going there basically to order them to increase their defence spending. Domestically, he has a problem as well. His MAGA base is split between hawks who wanted him to grasp this moment and seek to knock out the Iran's nuclear capacity, and those led by Tucker Carlson, really, the former Fox News host, who say no, the history of the MAGA movement is in isolationism. We shouldn't be getting engaged in any event. He was speaking to reporters en route to a NATO conference in Europe. And he's furious. He's obviously angry that this has happened, and he says they don't effing know what they're doing.
You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what they're doing. Do you understand that?
And then afterwards, you get a response from the Israeli government saying, oh yes, since you received that message from Donald Trump, we have restrained our aggression. So obviously all the players here are determined, at least at present, to be seen to be doing what Trump is ordering, to be stepping back from the brink. Now, Iran doesn't want to be seen to be doing that, but Israel certainly does, and Iran is playing ball so far.
Even for Donald Trump, seeing him use the F-bomb like that, it was pretty extraordinary, right?
Yeah, and, we perhaps shouldn't be shocked by this anymore. I think in his second administration, he's getting a lot looser than he used to be. We're seeing Donald Trump as he likes to be seen, I think. He doesn't play by old school rules. He's not a creature of DC. He speaks in this macho way. I think he kind of enjoys the looseness. I think he enjoys being able to speak like that to the world, unlike any other world leader, really.
So he's described this as a 12-day war. If we go back to what triggered the 12-day war, what do we actually know about Iran's nuclear capabilities historically? And what do we know about them as they stood in the lead up to this war?
I think it's worth going back a little way here to set the scene. Iran for a long time has been wanting to build a nuclear weapon. Netanyahu for a long time has been saying that cannot happen. We will not allow that to happen. In 2015, the Obama administration, in prolonged two-year negotiations led by John Kerry at the time, created this deal. It was going to be a deal which was made legal by the UN Security Council, but really was a deal led and negotiated by the United States, that they would let in inspectors, that it would continue with the nuclear program. The world would pretend that we agreed that this was a civilian program, though the world knew that it was not. And in return for limiting the amount of uranium that it processed and the purity to which it processed it, it would get relief from international sanctions. Trump gets in his first term and sets about undoing everything the Obama administration had done, including this, and he abandons that deal. Fast forward to 2020 to 21, 22, when Trump is back in office. Iran has walked away from the deal. It is processing more and more uranium, but it is still a member of the UN's Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means that the UN watchdog can still get into these facilities. And it is observing that the number of centrifuges that Iran is using to process uranium has increased. The amount of uranium material that it has processed to 60%, which is not quite weapons grade, but just a step back, has increased as well, in keeping with the fact that it's building more of these centrifuges and dispersing them across more than one site. And then in the past few months, the IEA says, okay, now there's been a really steep uptick. And just last month, it actually comes out and says, okay, now for the first time, Iran is in breach of its obligations under the UN treaty. And that is what gives Netanyahu the impetus to strike. Now, we don't exactly know how close it was to making a bomb. Netanyahu said within weeks or months. Netanyahu has said that many, many times. But the UN inspectors were ringing alarm bells. So that's where we were just before, on the cusp of this recent crisis.
Nick, we know that part of Iran's power and influence in the Middle East is its network of proxies and how it uses those proxies to fight its battles, if you will. You explored this in a piece recently, but how did Iran and that network become so vulnerable in the past, say, 18 to 24 months?
So you're right, short of a nuclear weapon, its great deterrence was these proxies that almost ringed Israel. They were Hezbollah north of Israel in Lebanon. They were Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. They were Hamas in Gaza. They were the Assad regime in Syria. They were in Syria. They were Houthis in Yemen. And then Hamas launches its massacre, its attack across the border from Gaza. Israel responds ferociously in this, tragic ongoing war we see today. Now, in that period, what it did is it thoroughly degraded Hamas. It annihilated Hamas in Gaza. And then it launched these strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon. You might remember the incredible attack that it launched against Hezbollah, which became known grimly, I suppose, as Operation Grim Beeper, when it smuggled in small devices, it smuggled in small explosive devices inside pages, and it knocked out 1,500 Hezbollah fighters that way. And it demonstrated that it had mastered its communications. The Houthi regime it strikes out at shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, and then the US leads an international effort to bomb that. So it's degraded. And Assad's regime collapses in Syria. So all of a sudden, over a period of a couple of years, this network of proxies across the region, of Iran's proxies, is thoroughly weakened. And that freed up Netanyahu to mount his attack, to take his attack to Iran far more directly.
Now, Netanyahu had in the last few months been asking the US, asking Donald Trump for help. Initially, that wasn't coming. At what point did he decide to go this alone?
Look, there's been really strong reporting on this. It appears that Trump was determined not to get involved in another war. As I mentioned earlier, it is, part of the DNA of the MAGA movement to extricate itself from long wars, particularly in the Middle East. And it is how he's defined his administration as being different to both Republican administrations in the past and Democratic administrations. But Netanyahu, freed as he was, appears to have forced his hand, or at least Netanyahu has decided to go it alone. Now, when Netanyahu launched his attacks on Iran, it was clear, the world already knew, that it did not have the weapons, it did not have the capacity to destroy those nuclear plants, particularly the deeply buried one at Fordow. Now, he decided to pull the trigger and go. So reporting since then suggests that at first Trump was infuriated, but he was impressed by how effective the strike was going. And there is good reporting from his White House, from people from the White House, from people with good ties, particularly from the New York Times, that he was convinced when he saw how effective it appeared that attack was going, that he thought, okay, if I can get in there and I can launch these strikes, which he had done in his first regime, he had used a bunker buster before. He believed if he could get in there, make this one attack and get out cleanly, he could balance his own base, the hawks and the doves in his ear there. He could look as though he had struck a blow for peace in the Middle East, and he could not lose any skin. So it appears that that's when he decided, okay, the United States will back Israel, at least to the extent of knocking out those deeply buried sites using B-2 aircraft and bunker buster bombs.
So we knew that Fordow was this really challenging environment, this nuclear mountain. It was difficult to reach, that only the US military apparently had the capability to knock it out. An expert you spoke to predicted that the US would get involved. They would strike. Indeed, they did. But what do we know about how effective that strike was or not, and whether the uranium stockpiles are still there?
Well, even as Donald Trump was claiming that he had totally obliterated the Iranian capacity to the Iranian nuclear program, we were hearing other people in his administration kind of stepping back in the hours afterwards. You had, after he made that statement, we have obliterated Iran's nuclear program, you had Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, say, we have obliterated Iran's ambition to build nuclear weapons. That's a significant difference in wording. And then in that same press conference where Hegseth made that point, you had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff say, well, we haven't done battle damage assessments yet. They're difficult. They're complicated. Now, it appears that first preliminary battle damage assessment has come in, and it appears that much as these things happened during the first Trump administration, it was promptly leaked. CNN and the New York Times have reported that, well, no, they don't believe with that preliminary assessment that those deep underground bunkers were destroyed. It could be that access to them was blocked. It could be that electricals going in and out of them were destroyed. We also, and you're just alluding to this in your question, we don't know that 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium was actually at the site. In fact, as we reported last week, spy satellites showed trucks, a fleet of trucks at that site in the days before the attack, which easily could have been moving 400 kilograms worth of uranium, which in one description I read could be moved in vehicles, in cars even. So there's all of that. And then, as I say, this assessment has come out saying, well, no, it's not destroyed, it is degraded. One voice in that New York Times story saying, well, we think that it has forced out the capacity to the gap between Iran deciding to race for a weapon from 3 months to 6 months.
Okay, so this is where I ask you to try and predict the future of all this. We've got this ceasefire, albeit a shaky one. We have the US and Israel both saying, look, we've achieved our objectives as they stand for now. However, we've got this report you've just talked to us about saying maybe those attacks weren't as effective as you've been led to believe. Where does this leave us? What might happen next?
Now we get back to known and unknown unknowns, I'm afraid. I can't see, and I don't think any credible analyst I've seen anywhere saying that we're in a stable peace. We know that the Iranian regime needs to protect itself, and it is clearly of the view that to protect itself it needs a nuclear weapon. It's clear that Netanyahu will not allow that to happen, and he's already shown a willingness to strike even without US support. At least in the presumption that he was going to get US support, he didn't have it. So both of those things can't stand. We know Donald Trump will probably want to claim victory and keep out of it. But there appears to be no one suggesting that Iran's capacity to, in the near term, build a nuclear weapon has been destroyed. And as long as it hasn't been, and as long as that regime stands, then the enmity between those two nations and the US will continue. And the set of circumstances that brought us to this crisis remain locked in place. I read something this morning, a comment made by John Kerry, who for 2 years sat down with Iranian negotiators to arrive at that original deal. So he and his team, probably the people in the West who know that regime and its determination as well as any. And he said overnight, you cannot bomb away the memory of how to make a bomb. You can't bomb away the knowledge that they have developed. And I find that pretty chilling.
Nick, I feel like I've said this before on this podcast, that this situation is complicated, it's fast-moving. We really appreciate your reporting on this, and we appreciate you joining us on the Morning Edition.
Oh, thank you for having me anytime.